June 6, 1944. The English Channel heaves in the dark like a living thing, steel grey and impatient, slapping against the ribs of landing craft packed shoulder to shoulder with young men who have not yet seen the beach that may end their lives. The air stinks of diesel fuel and cold seawater. Boots are already wet. Fingers numb around wooden stocks and parkerized steel. In the dim light before dawn, rifles rise and fall with the waves. Muzzles tilted up like a forest of thin black spires each, one capped with something that looks absurd, almost obscene, against all this gravity and fear. A simple condom rolled tight over the barrel. No ceremony. No speeches. Just rubber stretched over metal in the minutes before history breaks loose. It is not bravery that puts it there. It is doubt. Doubt that saltwater will not kill steel. Doubt that a single wet grain of sand will not turn a life-saving weapon into dead weight. And in that fragile seal between surf and trigger hangs the first shot of D-Day. Before the morning in Normandy would become legend, the world had already been at war for nearly 5 years. And Europe had been burning longer than most of the men in those landing craft had been adults. By the summer of 1944, Nazi Germany controlled most of continental Western Europe. Its Atlantic coastline hardened into concrete and steel under what Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. From Norway down to the Bay of Biscay, bunkers, minefields and gun emplacements faced the sea in endless lines, waiting for an invasion everyone knew was coming but no one could yet see. Across the water in Britain, the largest military force ever assembled prepared in silence. Operation Overlord, the Allied plan to return to Europe by force, gathered men and machines from half the world into one narrow island. American, British and Canadian divisions filled the English countryside. Tanks tore up hedgerows during live-fire exercises. Aircraft thundered overhead day and night. Ports vanished behind miles of crates, fuel drums and stacked rifles. And among all of that, among the bombers and battleships, the paratroopers and generals stood the infantrymen whose war would begin not with strategy but with one dry, functioning rifle in his hands as he stepped into the surf. In that build-up across southern England, war was not an abstraction. It was mud on boots after amphibious drills, oil on hands from cleaning weapons, and salt carried inland by the wind from a sea that many of the men would soon enter under fire. Training exercises along the British coast revealed one truth again and again: a rifle that went into the water did not always come out ready to fight. In peacetime manuals, Americans were taught that water itself was not fatal to a weapon, that a modern barrel could handle moisture if properly drained and dried. But landing on a hostile shore was not peacetime. Salt did not just wet steel, it began to eat it. Sand did not merely coat wood, it crept into actions and magazines, grinding against springs and bolts like poison dust. The standard American rifle, the M1 Garand, was a masterpiece of engineering for its time. A semi-automatic weapon that gave American infantrymen a decisive edge over bolt-action rifles in firepower. Yet it was still a machine, with tolerances and moving parts, and machines could betray a man the moment grit worked its way into the wrong place. Soldiers learned quickly that it was not enough to carry a weapon ashore. It had to arrive ready to fire in the first seconds when hesitation meant death. So the men improvised. They taped barrels shut, wrapped actions in cloth, greased metal until it shone dull and dark. And among the strangest and most effective of these field solutions was the simplest. A thin sleeve of rubber stretched over the muzzle, waterproof, flexible, easily discarded by a single shot. Condoms had been issued for health and morality, to fight an invisible enemy in brothels and backstreets far from the front. But now they were quietly reassigned another mission, standing guard at the very mouth of a rifle, keeping the sea itself from joining the battle. From that small, peculiar detail a condom stretched over the muzzle of a rifle, multiple truths begin to unfold, each one revealing a different layer of what that moment meant on Omaha and across the invasion front. Seen through a technical lens, the idea was brutally simple and mechanically sound. A rifle barrel is not ruined by water alone. Water can be shaken out. It can be boiled away in a single shot. What destroys a weapon is obstruction sand packed into the bore, grit wedged into the gas port, fragments of shingle forced inside by pressure. A clogged barrel does not merely fail to fire, it can burst, sending shrapnel backward into the hands and face of the man pulling the trigger. In the chaos of a surf landing, rifles were submerged again and again, often dragged under the weight of soaked packs and ammunition belts. A sealed muzzle was not protection against water alone, was insurance against the invisible enemy carried inside it. A layer of thin rubber could stop grains of sand that no human eye could see, and once the rifle fired, that rubber would vaporize instantly, kicked forward by the pressure of the expanding gases like it had never existed at all. Crude, unmilitary, almost laughable, and yet, in mechanical terms, completely logical. Viewed tactically, that single barrier took on even greater weight. The first 10 seconds on a hostile beach could decide the next 10 minutes. Machine guns in German bunkers were already firing before many American soldiers reached the sand. Mortar shells were crashing down with no warning. Men fell in water too deep to crawl from. Bodies piled against underwater obstacles. In those opening moments, infantry doctrine collapsed into instinct. Fire or die. A rifle that did not work immediately might as well have been a length of driftwood. There was no time to strip a weapon down and clean it. No shelter to work behind. A man who could not return fire became a moving target, worse than unarmed, because the enemy would see the weapon and assume resistance. One working gerund meant 8 shots in a handful of seconds. It meant suppressing fire, even briefly. It meant forcing a machine gunner to duck his head while another man ran. In a battle measured in yards gained and lives lost by the dozen, reliability was not a technical luxury, it was survival itself. And so that thin cack of rubber became, in its own quiet way, a tactical detail as important as the shape of the landing craft ramp or the timing of naval bombardment. But no detail of D-Day existed only in engineering terms. There was always a human dimension, and here the human story is as strange as it is telling. The American military of the Second World War issued condoms for one reason on paper: disease prevention. Venereal infections had crippled armies in past wars, invisible casualties that could sideline thousands without a single shot fired. Officers lectured. Medics distributed packets. Posters warned in blunt language. And most soldiers treated the whole affair with embarrassed humor. Condoms were joked about, hidden, traded, cost nothing, and yet carried tremendous social weight. Then, suddenly, they became something else. A piece of personal, private equipment was turned outward toward mud, seawater, and gunfire. Men who had been told all their lives that condoms were shameful now rolled them, without a word, onto the instruments of killing and survival. There was irony in it. There was nervous laughter. But there was also practicality. In cramped boats before dawn, with the dark pressing in and the channel spraying cold across their faces, modesty did not matter anymore. A rifle that worked mattered. Whatever emotion a man felt about that rubber a week earlier did not matter. What mattered was whether his finger closed on a trigger and heard a sound in return. Yet behind the humor and the ingenuity lay something deeper: the culture of improvisation that defined the Allied invasion more than any official checklist. Armies published doctrine. Soldiers rewrite it with tape and string. Every man heading for France carried official equipment, but no man carried only what was issued. Extra grenades jammed into pockets. Letters sealed in waxed paper. Socks inside helmets. And rifles altered in small ways by men who had learned, often the hard way, that regulation survived only as long as reality allowed it to. Some had factory-made covers over their weapons-thin plastic sleeves designed to tear away with the first shot. Others trusted tape. Others trusted grease. And some trusted a condom. Not because a book told them to, but because another soldier had tried it. Because it worked the last time. Because in war, proof was not found in manuals, but in what came back alive. And from that improvised beginning, the story begins to shift from technique and necessity towards something more complicated. Legend. The kind of legend that grows around unusual details. The kind of story that refuses to fade. And in that space between confirmed fact and remembered image, the condom on the rifle barrel took on a life of its own. If the first set of meanings revealed the practical and emotional layers of a condom stretched over steel, the second set exposes something larger about war itself. The space where logistics meets myth, where official solutions blur into rumor, and where tiny details gain outsized afterlives, long after the guns fall silent. Officially, the Allied armies did not rely on prophylactics to keep rifles dry. Engineers had designed purpose-built coverings, thin, sealed sleeves manufactured to protect the weapon during amphibious landings. They were issued in vast numbers to US forces and distributed as standard invasion equipment. In training and in theory, they worked exactly as intended: waterproof, disposable, easy to tear away with a single shot. But war is not a laboratory. In the rolling dark of the channel, covers tore on jagged equipment. Others vanished in the surf. Some were simply forgotten in the rush of last-minute preparations. And so the gap appeared again between what was planned and what was real. When official gear failed, men reached for what they trusted or for what they had. Which meant that the line between authorized equipment and field expedient protection all but disappeared the moment boots touched water. A condom did not replace the factory cover. It replaced nothing at all. It filled absence. It lived in the space between design and disaster, survival and chance. Across the channel, German defenders faced an entirely different relationship between man and machine. Their rifles and machine guns were dug into the hillsides and concrete of Normandy weeks, sometimes months, before June 6th. Positions were wired. Sights were aligned. Sandbags were stacked and restacked. The enemy did not have to swim ashore. His weapons began the day dry, loaded, and leveled. In that contrast is an unspoken truth of amphibious warfare. One side fights men. The other fights nature and fire at the same time. The sea is not neutral. It drags, chills, blinds, and drowns. It rots steel and stiffens hands. A German machine gunner did not worry whether his barrel was packed with sand. An American rifleman did. And so the smallest precautions, the most overlooked details became meaningful. What seems ridiculous in hindsight was never ridiculous in the surf. It was functional. It was serious. And for those who survived, it was unforgettable. Then, with time, the detail began to change. It became cleaner, sharper. In memory, the image hardened. Lines of rifles with condoms stretched stiffly over every muzzle, as if ordered by some unseen quartermaster. But historians, curators, and veterans tell a quieter version. The practice existed. It was real. There are photos from later wars showing unmistakable proof of the same trick. Memoirs mention it in passing. Articles note it as a battlefield expedient used whenever mud and water threatened reliability. But nowhere is there evidence that every man on D-Day did it. Or most. Or half. What exists instead is something more honest and more human. Fragments. Accounts that differ. Stories that misremember timelines. A truth that resists being counted. The condom on the rifle barrel lives somewhere between documentation and recollection. Not invented. Not universal. Real enough to matter. Rare enough to become legend. And because it was unusual, it endured. Over time, it absorbed exaggeration until it became shorthand for ingenuity itself. A tidy symbol for how soldiers adapt when the world collapses around them. It has been retold in documentaries, passed through veteran interviews, rediscovered by internet writers who half believe and half doubt it. And in the telling, it sometimes grows larger than it deserves to be. As if one thin strip of rubber alone made the difference between victory and defeat. But that was never its role. It did not win the beaches. It did not defeat machine guns or crumble bunkers. It did not matter to most men at all. But for some unknowable number it was the reason a weapon fired cleanly instead of choking. And in a battle where margins were measured in heartbeats, that was more than enough. Because all of this myth, memory, improvisation leads inevitably back to the sand itself. To the moment when theory, invention, superstition and necessity all collided. To a timeline measured not in years or days, but in seconds. The moment when the ramps dropped. When water surged in. When men stepped forward into gunfire. And every rifle, whether taped, sleeved or sealed with rubber, faced the same final test. The sea had done its worst. Now the weapons had to answer. The sky above the channel was still heavy with darkness when the first landing craft lurched toward Omaha Beach. It was just before 6:30 a.m. in the morning. Low clouds pressed close to the water, suffocating the horizon in grey. Inside the pitching boats, men stood hunched beneath the weight of their gear. Rifles held tight against their chests, boots sloshing in seawater as waves broke over the bow. Some were already soaked to the waist before the ramps ever dropped. Faces were pale. A few men retched quietly into the bilge. Others stared at nothing at all, hypnotized by the grind of engines and the knowledge that the world beyond the steel door was about to erupt. Then the ramps fell. The water was deeper than expected. Men plunged into it, weighed down by ammunition, radios and steel helmets that dragged their heads under the surface if they stumbled. The surf was not red yet. It was grey and foam-flecked, violent and blinding. Somewhere ahead lay sand and barbed wire, obstacles of iron and wood, and beyond them, guns that had been waiting all night. The first bursts from German positions cracked through the gloom. Machine gun rounds tore into water, skipping and snapping like thrown knives. Men fell before they had taken 2 steps forward. Some never rose. Others crawled, coughing sea from lungs, rifles clutched high like an offering. Some rifles fired the moment their owners hit shallower ground. Others did not. Bolts hesitated. Triggers clicked uselessly. Muzzles clogged with sand. On that narrow strip between tide and death, equipment became fate. The difference between living long enough to reach the shingle and dying where the surf ran over your boots could be as small as a single grain of Normandy sand packed inside a barrel. There was no time to notice it in advance. No chance to wipe or shake or disassemble. A man lifted his rifle, shouldered it with fingers that could barely feel the wood, and pulled the trigger because nothing else existed in that moment except that one mechanical relationship between finger and steel. For some, the weapon answered immediately. For others, it faltered. For a few, something thin and colourless vanished from the muzzle as the rifle spoke a breath of rubber erased by flame. The sea pushed back by pressure. The beach was chaos in motion. Men stumbled forward and died in motion. Engineers tried to cut wire under direct fire. Medics crawled through broken bodies with hands slick, not just with seawater. The tide kept coming in, and with it, more wreckage lifeless and mechanical. Amphibious tanks lay broken offshore, their promise of armoured support drowned before it could reach the beach. Officers shouted orders into a wind that carried nothing back. Platoons collapsed into scattered knots of survivors who didn't know each other's names, only that someone nearby had a working weapon and someone else had explosives. And above it all, from the bluffs and embrasures, German gunners worked their weapons with practiced rhythm. Yet still, men moved forward, inch by inch, rifle by rifle. A functioning gun here meant a few seconds of return fire. Those seconds meant heads ducking in pillboxes. They meant a chance to run, to crawl, to reach the brief safety of a crater before pushing on again. And all along that killing ground, there were rifles that had come through the sea clean. Rifles that fired without hesitation. Rifles that did what they were built to do. No one paused to think about how. No one thanked rubber or tape or factory plastic. There were no thoughts of ingenuity. There was only motion-painful, desperate movement across a place that did not want them there. But somewhere in that nightmare, amid the thunder of naval guns and the sharp whips of machine fire, one small truth quietly revealed itself again and again. The sea had been beaten, not by strategy, not by command, but by preparation measured in inches and seconds. And on Omaha Beach, on the morning of June 6th, that was enough to keep men alive long enough to fight back. By mid-morning, Omaha Beach was no longer a single battlefield. It had fractured into dozens of smaller wars, each one fought by clusters of men pinned behind hedgehog obstacles, torn landing craft, and the low folds of sand near the high tide line. Smoke rolled in thick as weather. The air reeked of cordite and diesel and blood. Offshore, naval guns hammered the bluffs again and again, trying to collapse concrete and silence the guns that had turned this narrow stretch of sand into a graveyard. And within that inferno, the men who had made it to the waterline with working rifles pressed forward in short bursts, firing, crawling, dragging the wounded, firing again. The shingle embankment at the back of the beach became a natural rally point. Those who reached it collapsed behind the stones, gasping for breath, hands trembling violently as adrenaline burned itself through cold muscles. Rifles were checked there for the first time since the ramp dropped. Bolts were racked. Magazines slapped in place. Actions were wiped with bloodied sleeves. Weapons that had swallowed too much sand were taken apart with shaking fingers while bullets pitched into the rocks inches away. Some rifles were already finished barrels bent by shrapnel. Stock split, actions seized. They were abandoned without ceremony. But others still worked. Enough of them worked. And that was what changed everything. Because behind the shingle, behind the smoke, and beneath the thunder of naval fire, American infantry finally began to return fire in earnest. The beaches did not fall silent, but the balance shifted. Each clean shot, each magazine emptied into a German firing slit, robbed the defenders of certainty. Machine gun crews were forced to lower their heads. Riflemen in concrete embrasures hesitated before exposing themselves again. The defenders could no longer fire without answer. And in that narrow pause those dangerous, precious secondsmen surged forward toward the base of the bluffs. Small groups formed not by rank, but by gravity. Whoever had a working radio became central. Whoever still had explosives became essential. Those with rifles that fired became anchors for everyone else. Engineers moved under covering fire to blow gaps through wire and mines. Officers found themselves leading squads they had never met. Privates found themselves making decisions no one would ever record. Every advance was paid for in blood. But advances, finally, were being made. Cliffs that had looked insurmountable from the water became pathways for climbing men with raw hands and broken fingernails. German positions, built to dominate the beach from the front, were assaulted from the side and rear. Grenades were thrown into firing ports designed to only look outward. Bunkers were cleared from behind by men who had scarcely believed they would leave the sea alive an hour earlier. And slowly, almost invisibly, the impossible began to happen. The beach was no longer owned by the guns above it. This story, told from a distance, often sounds like inevitability. As if steel hulls and scripted bombardments had already decided the outcome before the ramps ever dropped. But on Omaha, nothing felt inevitable. There was no sense of unfolding destiny-only struggle. Only the uncertainty of whether the man next to you would still be there in 5 seconds. Whether the next cover would actually protect you. Whether the rifle in your hands would answer the next time you pulled the trigger. And in that uncertainty, the smallest decisions gained immense weight. A man who had sealed his muzzle had not tried to alter history. He had simply tried to survive the water. But survival compounded. Enough weapons survived to create fire. Enough fire created movement. Enough movement broke positions. And by noon, the thin, fragile line at the water's edge had turned into a widening, bloody corridor, pushing inland. The invasion did not end that morning. It had only begun. But something irreversible had happened. The Atlantic wall had been pierced. What had been designed to be impenetrable had been breached not by perfection, but by persistence. Not by flawless machinery, but by flawed, frightened men whose equipment, some of it taped, some of it sleeved, some of it sealed with rubber, had worked long enough. And when the firing finally eased in certain pockets along the sand, when wounded were dragged back toward the water and the dead lay still under the grey sky, no one spoke of luck or clever tricks. No one tallied how many rifles had survived the sea because of a condom or tape or factory plastic. But the fact remained, etched quietly into the wreckage. A weapon that keeps firing becomes a foothold. A foothold becomes a breach. And a breach, once opened, changes the course of war. By the time night fell over Normandy on June 6th, the ocean had given everything back that it could not keep. Broken landing craft lay twisted along the tide line. Packs and helmets floated in slow, aimless circles just offshore. Rifles were scattered everywhere in the surf, in the sand, half buried like relics from another age. Some were still loaded. Some were beyond saving. Others, improbably, still worked. And in the hours after the guns fell quiet, ordnance crews and armourers moved across the beach, collecting what they could, wiping down steel slick with brine and blood, sorting weapons with the same urgency they sorted the wounded. Normandy did not allow equipment to rest. Within days, the beach would no longer be battlefield, but artery, a massive lifeline feeding men and machines inland. So every usable rifle mattered. Every bolt that still cycled, every barrel still straight enough to fire, was returned to service. In makeshift repair points behind the sand dunes and shattered villages, craftsmen in uniform worked feverishly to reverse the sea's damage. They stripped weapons to their bones. They boiled parts to chase away salt. They scraped corrosion from steel with improvised tools. Some rifles could be saved. Others were cannibalized so that still more could live on. There was no ceremony in it. Only necessity. And slowly, a pattern emerged in the chaos. Rifles that had arrived cleaner were easier to save. Barrels that had kept out grit were less likely to be ruined. Weapons whose internal spaces had not been flooded with sand were restored faster. No one wrote this down as doctrine, but the men who worked the benches saw it clearly. It was not a matter of superstition. It was simple mechanics. Fewer grains inside meant fewer failures later. The war did not pause in Normandy. The hedgerows swallowed men and equipment alike. Mud clung to everything. Rain rotted canvas and swelled wood. Rifles were never clean for long. But the lessons of the beach travelled with the men. They greased harder, wrapped more carefully, watched their muzzles more closely. Anything that kept dirt out of a barrel was no longer strange. It was common sense. Condoms, tape, cloth, purpose-made covers, whatever, stop the world from entering a weapon was considered fair. No one thought of it as clever. It had simply become part of how survival was done. As the front moved east and summer burned itself into autumn, stories of D-Day began to settle into memory. Veterans spoke of the surf, of the sound of machine guns, like cloth tearing endlessly in the air. They spoke of friends who never rose from the water. They spoke of moments that lasted forever and others that vanished in a flash. And in small circles, in letters, conversations, kitchens, long after the war had ended, sometimes a quieter detail surfaced. Not a hero's name. Not a general's speech. But a detail strange enough to remain sharp across decades. A condom stretched over the barrel of a rifle. A laugh. A shrug. a memory folded into something almost unreal by repetition. Yet the beaches did not permit nostalgia. What remained in official records were numbers. Casualties. Tonnage landed. Divisions ashore. Weapons lost or repaired. And in those ledgers, no line item existed for ingenuity or awkward humour. There was no category for rubber or superstition or luck. There were only tallies of steel and flesh. But within those impersonal reports was a quieter truth, unspoken and uncounted. The smallest details of personal survival had a way of echoing through enormous events. A man who lived through the surf was another rifle inland. Another body to climb a slope. Another voice in the shouting mass that became the breakout from the beachhead. And so, even as Allied forces pushed further into France and the beaches of Normandy became clogged with convoys and cranes instead of corpses, the shadow of that morning lingered not in grand strategy, but in habits. In the way a man treated his weapon. In the way he sealed it against a wet dawn. In how he never again assumed that a piece of equipment would survive the world unprotected. The beach had taught that lesson too brutally to forget. Long after the hedgerows of Normandy gave way to the open fields of France and the long road toward Germany, the habits born on that beach followed soldiers into other wars, other climates, and other generations. Korea froze rifles solid. Vietnam filled them with jungle rot and red clay. New technologies arrived: synthetic stocks, sealed primers, purpose-built muzzle covers, but the problem remained the same. Nature still attacked before the enemy did. Moisture crept in. Dirt found its way into the smallest spaces. And wherever official equipment failed or ran out, soldiers reached again for what worked. Photographs from later wars make the truth unmistakable. Rifle barrels capped with condoms, plastic bags tied tight before river crossings, weapons wrapped in improvised skins against monsoon rain. What had once seemed odd became unremarkable. The trick migrated from rumour into routine, from something joked about into something passed down by example. And yet, even as it became normal in the field, it slowly transformed in memory. The image sharpened. It detached itself from circumstances and spread outward. The condom on the gun became a symbol of ingenuity, of gallows humour, of a war fought by men who reshaped ordinary objects into tools of survival. But symbols are dangerous things. They simplify. Over time, the story began to sound larger than it was. Online, in books written long after the guns fell silent, the condom sometimes became a miracle. A clever fix that saved the invasion. A hidden trick, known by everyone. And as often happens with good stories, the details were smoothed until the edges disappeared. The truth is, both smaller and stronger. Condoms did not win D-Day. They did not change the outcome of the war. They did not rescue entire divisions from the sea. What they did do, what they really did, was much quieter. They kept a few weapons cleaner. They saved a few rifles from worthlessness. And in doing so, they allowed a few men to fire when firing mattered. History does not record those names. It cannot. It has no room for causes that do not leave paper. But absence from reports does not mean absence from reality. It only means that some things matter too briefly, too locally, too personally to be preserved in ink. In museums and archives, in climate-controlled rooms far from saltwater, D-Day weapons sit behind glass. Their steel is static now. Their wood no longer swells. The battlefield has been reduced to labels and maps, arrows and dates. Now and then, among these preserved remnants of the largest invasion in human history, a visitor will notice a quiet photograph. A rifle with something pale at its tip. Something out of place. Something human. And for a moment, history stops feeling distant. The war is no longer only about fleets and flags and headlines. It is about cold fingers, wet boots, and a small decision made on a rolling deck in the dark. Because wars are not survived in the abstract. They are survived in inches. In seconds. in small choices that no general ever ordered and no planner ever mapped. And sometimes survival is not a matter of courage alone. Sometimes it is the result of a thin barrier between chaos and function, between a dead piece of steel and a living, breathing man who still has one more chance to fight. In the end, the story of a condom stretched over the muzzle of a rifle is not really about rubber, or even about weapons. It is about how human beings behave when the world becomes unrecognizable. D-Day is remembered as thunder and steel, as armadas on the horizon and armies colliding on the shore. But it was also quiet moments in the dark, men kneeling on cold metal decks, checking and rechecking the smallest things, because the smallest things were all they could still control. Against the scale of the invasion, no single act seems important. Against the scale of a single life, everything does. History likes grand answers. It searches for reasons in speeches and strategies, in named operations and famous faces. But wars are rarely decided only by decisions made at tables. They are shaped just as much by decisions made alone, in silence, by people who will never appear in textbooks. A rifle that fires. A wound that misses an artery. A wave that breaks just differently enough to let a man stand back up. These are not footnotes to history. They are its hidden foundation. The condom on the rifle barrel endures not because it was widespread or official, but because it feels true. It speaks to something timeless about soldiers in every war. The instinct to adapt, the refusal to surrender to circumstance, the quiet creativity that appears when no one is watching and no one is recording. In a battle where men were reduced to targets and numbers, this small act reasserted humanity. It said, wordlessly, that even inside industrial war, survival was still personal. And perhaps that is why the image remains so powerful. Not because it is shocking, not because it is funny, but because it exposes a truth too easily forgotten, that history does not only move forward on the tracks of tanks or in the roar of aircraft. Sometimes it moves forward on something as thin as stretched rubber, and on the decision of one anonymous person who simply wanted his weapon to work when it mattered most.